Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Outlaws of Thunder Junction limited set review. Quick disclaimer, this set review only covers around half of the cards because the full set is not yet revealed, but this is when I had time to record this video, so I wanted to give my thoughts on the cards that I could. Anyway, let's dive straight in with the grading scale. A's are the best of the best. B's are cards that pull you into a color. C's are solid playables that fill out the bulk of your deck. D's are filler, that are cards you can sometimes play, but they're never really special, and then F's are unplayables. In the commons and uncommons, which are the cards I'm going to be covering in this video, you don't really see any A's, but you usually see a lot of C's, a few D's, and a few B's, so that's kind of the general trend, and oftentimes I'll give pluses or minuses to reflect if a card is on the higher end of a range or on the lower. So like a D plus is a card that you'll put in your deck and you won't be that unhappy about it, but you'll never actively take it during the draft, things like that. Anyway, let's dive straight in. We're starting with the gold uncommons to get a sense for the archetypes before diving in, and I'll cover the mechanics as they come up. Eartha Joe. Frontier Mentor is a 4-mana card in red-white. It's a 2/4, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red mercenary that can tap to give target creature +1/+0 until end of turn at sorcery. So it's kind of an aggressive creature because you can't buff things defensively, but 1/1s are still decent blockers. So it's a 4-mana 2/4 that comes with a 1/1 that has an ability, and when you activate an ability that targets a creature or player, you copy that ability so you can choose new targets. So you get to use those little mercenary creatures twice, or the one that you already have. That's pretty good. So you can choose new targets for the copy, you can choose the same target. So this often plays out as like a 4-mana 4/4 if it's your turn, because then you can copy that +1/+0 ability, or you can buff up your other creatures with +2/+0. This card is quite good, I think. It seems relatively splashable. It remains to be seen how much you'll want to be splashing in this set, or whether your aggressive decks will be interested in splashing. But assuming you're in a red-white deck, I think this card is probably a B. You can get other mercenary cards and have that work well with them. The +1/+0s just flying around, and if you can just buff up your creatures a lot, this card has a really good ability. And if they kill it right away, then you still are left with a 1/1 behind. So I think this card is just a B, just quite solid. Next is Form a Posse. X red white, you create X 1/1 mercenary creature tokens. Well, there's your army in a can. I mean, this card is a sort of one where you'll want a little bit of synergy, because if you play like 5 mana for 3 1/1s, that's not crazy good. The benefit is they can buff each other up. They can buff up your other cards. They can be kind of pseudo equipment in a way. I think this card is more of a C- though, partially because it's a gold card. You don't really want to dive into 2 colors early. Though, if you do cast this in the late game, it is quite formidable. So, if you get up to 8 mana and get 6 1/1s that can all buff each other, the problem is red-white often isn't that sort of controlling deck. So, if you are a slower deck, this card goes up to a C+, or maybe even a B-. But if you have to be reliably casting it for huge X values, and I don't believe that red-white is doing that. So, I think in most decks, it's going to be a C- or something around there, unless you have token synergies or things like that. Next is Intimidation Campaign, so a blue-black card. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses a life, you gain a life, and you draw a card. So kind of like Disinformation Campaign from back in the day, except they don't have to discard a card, which was pretty much the most brutal part of that card. When you commit a crime, you may return Intimidation Campaign to its owner's hand. And so crimes, which is a mechanic in this set, are targeting opponents, anything they control, and or cards in their graveyard. So that's a mechanic in this set. And so committing a crime happens when you cast removal spells or just target things in general. It's going to come up quite a lot. And being able to get an extra card out of it every single time and gain a life to help you stabilize and use this card looks quite good to me. I'd probably put it in the B range as well. It's just consistent card advantage and life gain and slowly draining your opponent out of the game. You do have to make sure your deck has interaction spells, but I assume blue and black decks are going to have a lot of interaction, and it's just a great control finisher because you can play this on turn 3, you get a card. Maybe it's more of a B- than a B, but still quite nice. Moving on to Lasav, Familiar Stranger, so it's 1 blue-black for a 1/4. If you commit a crime, you put a counter on the stranger, then you can exile a card from a graveyard, and you can have him become a copy of a creature of the card that you exile, if it's a creature. So only triggers once each turn, but it can trigger during your opponent's turn, so that's worth noting as well. 3 mana 1/4, okay stats, but the fact that it grows pretty quickly is quite nice. So if you have ways to commit crimes, you'll want to keep an eye out for them, but a growing 3-drop is quite nice. I think this card's probably a B- or a B in that range as well. Next up is Miriam, Herd Whisperer, 2 mana for a 3/2. Already just straight up pretty good stats for 2 mana. As long as it's your turn, mounts and vehicles you control have hexproof. So mounts is a new mechanic in this set where you can saddle up and tap your creatures as if they were vehicles to mount the creature, and then the creature gets extra abilities. That's pretty much what happens. Whenever a mount or vehicle you control attacks, put a counter on it. So that's quite good for a mount deck. Green-white looks like it's going to be the color combination that cares about mounts and saddling up, and this card is perfect for that deck because the creature has to attack. It doesn't have to deal damage, so it's going to make it really hard to block in the early turns. If you like play this on turn 2, you hit them for 3, next turn you play a mount, next turn after that you saddle up and attack, all of a sudden you're like doing some major damage. So I think this card's probably going to be a B- in those decks, or even a B if you have enough mounts. The real like factor in this is if you have enough like mounts and cards to saddle up to consistently get those counters, because if it's just a 2-mana 3/2, then it's more of a C+ than anything, considering how strong cards are in limited these days. Next is Congregation Gryff. So this is one of those mounts. 3-mana 1/4 flying lifelink, which is already just pretty rock solid. Like 3-mana 1/4 flying lifelink, you'd play that. That's a good defensive body. Chips in for some damage, gains you some life, big life swing with evasion, like lots of toughness. But if it is saddled, which it is a high saddle number, saddle 3, it gets +X/+X, where X is the number of mounts you control. So at the very baseline, it'll get +1/+1. Another payoff for having some mounts in green-white, because if you're hitting them for 3 points of lifelink in the air, if you get a second mount into play, that's pretty dang hard to race. And if you can get even just this, racing 2 points of lifelink in the air can be pretty good as well. But you do have to pay that cost of tapping one of your creatures, which maybe could have been used to block. So anyway, I think this card's pretty good. On its own, it's probably like a C+. And if you have other mount synergies at all, which I assume green-white will have, it can definitely get into the B- range. I'd be willing to take this early. It's a great 3-drop. Next is Kraum, Violent Cacophony. It's a 4-mana 2/3 flyer. When you cast your second spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Kraum and draw a card. Now, there is a mechanic that I will mention here. It's funny, I can't remember the exact name of it off the top of my head. I think it's like, it might be called Scheme or something like that. But we'll see cards that have the mechanic for sure later on. But basically, it lets you pay the mana for a card in advance and then put it into exile, and then you can cast it for free later. And so that plays really well with this, because that just means on turn 4 you can play Kraum, play a card that you previously set aside for free, and then you can immediately get your second spell, you get that counter, and you draw a card. Assuming you have that set up, this card is really strong, because if you get the card back immediately, you've got like a 4-mana 3/4 flyer. And so I think it's going to be like a B if you are in the blue-red deck that cares about doing that. If your deck is just like splashing this card and you don't have ways to set it up, and you're just trying to naturally cast 2 spells, you'll definitely want to play some cheap spells in your deck, but it does get a little bit worse. But I'm assuming you can set this up pretty consistently in blue-red, put cheap spells in your deck, put those cards that I think it's called Scheme into your deck. We'll see in a minute, but yeah, I don't want to be giving too much misleading information, but there is a mechanic in this set that lets you basically put things on layaway and cast them later, and this is the perfect payoff for that. And so I think this is going to be really strong in the set. Next up is Honest Rutstein. So it's 3 mana for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. Creature spells cost 1 less. So this card just does it all. 3 mana, 3/2, great value. You want to be able to fill your graveyard with this sort of card, because one of the downsides of this sort of effect is if you want to play it on turn 3, which is when you'll get the most benefit out of the creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. That's when you'll get the most benefit, is when you play this on curve. But you won't always have creatures in your graveyard by that point. So you'll want to have some self-mill or things like that if you can find it. But this card is excellent. Playing it in the mid to late game is just a 3-mana 3/2 Gravedigger is fantastic. I think this card's definitely in the B- range. Just really excellent card. And one really nice thing about this card is it stacks. Some cards like this don't stack these days, but if you have 2 copies of Honest Rutstein, you trade one off, and then you can play the next one, get back the first Honest Rutstein, and kind of have a little bit of a loop going there. I'm just reading the card again just to double check that works, because that stuff is kind of tricky sometimes. But return to a creature from your graveyard. So yeah, you can loop these cards if you can get 2 of them, which is quite powerful. Next is Badlands Revival. 5 mana for a sorcery. Return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Return up to 1 target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This permanent, the second permanent, can also be a creature, so you can get a creature to your hand and a creature into play. This is a really nice version of this effect. Historically, we've seen 5 mana put a creature from your graveyard into play, which has never been quite good enough. But this gets you a 2-for-1 and immediately an impact, which I think is quite powerful, because normally the downside of these sorts of effect is they put you behind on tempo. But if you're like putting your 6-drop back into play and putting a creature into your hand, which is the best case scenario, you're coming seriously far ahead. And I think this card is excellent as a rule. This card's like a B, I think. It's also quite splashable if you're playing like a late game, if you're playing like a green-blue ramp deck and you're going to have some big creatures. This can be a really nice card to splash as well. And I think this card's going to be a B. It's a B/B- depending on if you have big creatures and you're trying to grind and stuff like that. But I assume green-black is going to be doing that. It's kind of like in the same level of the Honest Rutstein card, but where Honest Rutstein struggles, as we talked about, from not always having a creature when you play it on turn 3. This card, as a late game sorcery, is oftentimes going to be able to have a target in the graveyard, which is quite nice. Also, imagine just like playing this and like bringing back a Honest Rutstein and then getting another creature back, and it's just like a nice little chain. So this card's quite good. Next is Wrangler of the Damned. 5 mana for a 1/4. That's quite low stats, so the ability is going to have to carry this one. It has flash, so Nice, your understated tiny creature isn't going to just immediately die. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, create a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. So this once again plays off of that mechanic, which I can't remember the name of it, but I'm pretty sure it's called scheming. So if you are putting your cards on layaway, then you can get extra 2/2s every turn. So what you could do is you flash this in on your opponent's end step. On your turn, you either put some cards on layaway, or I'm just going to call it that until we see one to confirm. But you put some cards on the layaway, and then you'll get a 2/2, and then you can start casting your cards from exile. So getting a 2/2 every turn that has flying is really powerful. If you see this as a 5-mana 1/4 that comes with a 2/2 flyer, then you're getting 3/6 worth of stats for 5 mana, which is quite nice. A 1/4 is a little bit hard to kill for some decks, like if the burn spells don't do quite that much damage or things like that. And so Wrangler of the Damned seemed like a very nice card to me. Especially if you're trying to build like maybe a Jeskai control deck and you have a lot of the scheming cards, I think this card can do some serious work. And as a result, I'd be willing to take it highly. I think it's more of a B- than a B, just straight up B, just because it is kind of understated. And if you're on the back foot, it's sometimes hard to just always play your cards a turn off of schedule. But if you're like an aggressive deck and you're just getting 2/2s every turn, your opponent has to kill this or they just lose, which does give it a lot of power. So I think this is a B-, though it could be a C+ if your deck isn't like quite like the right fit. You need to build around it a little bit, but it's quite powerful if you have the ability to still develop your board while doing this. And in the worst case scenario, you can just like start hoarding spells in your hand and doing nothing on your turn, or casting instants on your opponent's turn and things like that. So quite a nice card. Next is Jolene, Joe Plundering Pugilist. We have a 3-mana 4/2, so not typically the greatest stats, but when you attack with a creature with power 4 or greater, you get a treasure token. So it ramps you, and you can sacrifice a treasure to deal 1 damage to any target. So one thing you can do is prevent yourself from trading with like a random 2/1 by attacking, making a treasure before blocks, sacrifice that treasure, and deal 1 damage to any target. Making a treasure is really, really nice. It ramps you into your more expensive plays. I think this card is quite powerful, and especially if you have like beefier 4-powered creatures, like a 4/4 that your opponent is going to necessarily be able to block as effectively. You don't always have to send this into combat because it'll trigger when other creatures with power 4 or greater attack. So that's worth noting as well. And the ability to like sacrifice treasures to ping things means that your opponent doesn't always have as good of double block. So if you have a 4/4 or something and you attack it in, you get a treasure, they can't really block it with a 3/3 and a 2/2 because of your ping ability. Pinging is generally quite powerful and limited. Just being able to deal 1 damage to things. You can even stack up the treasures if you get a couple of them. I think this card's quite good. I would probably give it a C+ just because the stats aren't crazy and the ability to activate is pretty expensive. But if you have a lot of 4-powered creatures, I could see taking this at like a B- level. And once you're already in green-red, I could see taking this a bit higher. It's just that 4/2 isn't the greatest stat line historically in Limited. Next is Ruthless Lawbringer. So that's 3 mana, and also maybe red-green's theme is 4 powers matters, which has been a theme in red-green in the past. Just something to note. Looking at these gold cards, the reason I'm going through them first is because they can give us a sense of the theme maybe. So if we're just thinking back, like red-white maybe cares about those 1/1 tokens that can like tap to buff your guys. Blue-black maybe cares about like committing a lot of crimes, and green-black cares about the graveyard, and red-green cares about 4 power, and blue-red cares about like casting second spells, and blue-white cares about like not casting spells on your turn. So maybe those are just some general ideas. Obviously, we have a limited sample size of we haven't seen every gold card for every color combination, but those are just some general ideas we can kind of glean here as we evaluate the cards, because if the cards are supported, they get much better, obviously. Ruthless Lawbringer is 3 mana for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. That's really powerful because you can just get rid of your worst thing and kill their best thing. It's not technically a 2-for-1 unless that creature was like kind of incapacitated by a pacify or something like that. But if you're making tokens, which red-white looks like it can do, so I assume black-white can do that as well, this is a really powerful card and probably like B- level power level, because if you're supporting this, or maybe you have cards that you actively want to sacrifice, creatures that you want to actively sacrifice, not cards, then you're in good shape. So I think this card's like a B- and really quite good. Next is Make Your Own Luck. 5 mana, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You can exile a non-land card from among them. If you do, it becomes plotted. That's what it's called. It's called plotting, not scheming. Jeez Louise. There we go. You can cast it later without paying its mana cost, and you put the rest into your hand. So 5 mana for a draw 3, and you can plot one of the cards, so you get to cast it for free on a later turn. That's pretty nice. It is slow, but if you're like trying to rebuild, like trying to get some advantage in the late game, you're going to have a really good catch-up turn the following turn because you get to plot one of those cards. You can also plot like a really expensive card, so you can like plot like a 6-drop or a 7-drop or whatever you do find and just immediately start catching up. This card looks really good to me. I think it's definitely like a B- range. I generally save like the Bs for the cards that are like, okay, when you play this, it's an immediate problem, because you can definitely cast this and then die on the next turn before you've really developed. But this is like really strong. It's the sort of card where you're in a top deck battle and your opponent plays this, you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm just so dead. So it's called plotting, not scheming. I was on the same wavelength, but that's why I didn't want to get too committed to saying exactly what it was called. New mechanics, a lot of them, and sometimes I don't remember everything. Next is Vial Smasher, Gleeful Grenadier. So it's 2 mana for a 3/2. Just typical stats, I guess, for gold cards these days. We already saw one of those in green-white. And whenever another Outlaw, so Outlaws includes Assassins, Mercenaries, Pirates, Rogues, and Warlocks. So just keep an eye out for those creature types. Whenever one enters the battlefield under your control, Vial Smasher deals 1 damage to target opponent. So just a nice aggressive threat. I think this does fall more into the C+ range rather than like the B range, just because it doesn't like take over the game on its own. It's just like a really, really good card to play on turn 2 in your red-black deck that presumably cares about Assassins, Mercenaries, Pirates, Rogues, Warlocks, so Outlaws. So really nice card. Definitely one I'm excited to play. Once you're in red-black specifically, like the delineation between Bs and Cs are cards that like you take early and you're willing to like pay that cost of a gold card to like try to make sure it gets in your deck, versus this is the sort of card that once you're in red black, you're like really excited to have it. So that's kind of like a delineation for the gold cards, because not every gold card is worth taking super early because it's not as flexible as a normal monocolored card. Next is At Knife Point, another red-black card. As long as it's your turn, Outlaws you control have first strike. So it looks like red-black is the main Outlaws color. Whenever you commit a crime, you create a mercenary token. So these mercenary tokens can be pretty nice. Looks like those are primarily focused in the Mardu colors. Red-white like uses them to buff its creatures. Black-red uses them because they are outlaws, and then black-white maybe uses them to sacrifice. But giving your creatures first strike isn't necessarily that good, so you're going to want to commit a lot of crimes. Once you've created 2 tokens from this, you're probably in okay shape because these tokens are better than just a basic 1/1, but you really want to be creating like 3 or even 4. And it's also important that these outlaws can only target creatures you control, so you can't like use them to trigger crime committing. So that's worth noting as well. But still, pretty reasonable card. I'd probably give this one a C, though. It's more of a build-around card than anything, and I think you need like a decent number of ways to target your opponent's stuff before you're happy playing this card. It could even be like a C-. It's kind of hard to use, and if you're trying to build an aggressive deck, like with the Vial Smasher, then, I mean, it does do a lot of pinging if you combine this with Vial Smasher, and you have a lot of ways to target things, but you're hearing me say the word if a lot, and that's not really where you want to be with these sorts of cards. Moving on to the commons, kicking things off with white. So we just did the gold uncommons to get a sense for what the color combinations are maybe doing. And now we're just going into the commons, going color by color, and then the uncommons going color by color. So very standard set reviewy stuff. Although, as I said at the very beginning, not every common and uncommon is going to be covered. Just like about half of them, like 80 something cards or thereabouts. And there's going to be like 180 commons and uncommons total. So about half. So we'll get a good sense of the set. I mean, once you've seen a lot of the cards, you can kind of get an idea of how things go. Anyway. Armored Armadillo, a nice little tongue twister there. 1 mana for a 0/4 ward 1. So this is a great blocker, just off starters. It's really hard to kill 0/4s, and the fact that it has ward 1 makes removal even less effective against it. Then in the late game, you can buff it, give it +X+0, where X is its toughness. So you can turn it into a 4/4 in the late game temporarily, and that's pretty reasonable. I mean, if you're a defensive deck, this is the sort of card you're going to want. I think because... yeah, I think the main problem I see with this card is the 1/1 tokens that buff power. But I think this card falls right into that like D+ range where it's not going to be like the essential point of your strategy, I don't think, but it's the sort of card that you'll put into some of your slower decks and be pretty happy with it, or you'll use it as a really effective sideboard card. So I can't see prioritizing this super highly, but a 1 mana 0/4 with ward 1 is really a brick wall for a lot of decks. And yeah, the main downside is that your opponent can just kind of attack with impunity past it because it never threatens a block. So you never know if they're like bluff attacking with a combat trick or something like that until you get to 4 mana, at which point, if you have a lot of instants, this could be a good way to like use your mana. But yeah, I'm going to give this a D+ for now. Next is Ariet's Lullaby. 2 mana, destroy target tapped creature, you gain 2 life, sorcery speed. The life gain does help on this sort of card. Destroying a tapped creature is not always the best because sometimes your opponent's best creature isn't always tapped. Sometimes they have some sort of way to untap it or things like that, or they get to hit you with it first because this is a sorcery, so you'll take like 5 damage from their big creature before you can kill it. But the life gain coming back is pretty nice, and so I think this is probably going to be like right around a C-. Not a card you're like thrilled to play, but a card that you'll just fill out your deck with if you're a slower deck. It's probably like, if you're an aggressive deck, it's in the D range because your opponent's creatures are going to be untapped so they can block. But if you're a like defensive deck, this is like a C, and then if you're an aggressive deck, it's like a D+. So probably falling in the C- range. Next is Holy Cow. It's funny that a card that has like a meme name almost is actually quite good. 3 mana for a 2/2 flash flyer is pretty reasonable, and the fact that you gain 2 life really helps you in a racing situation, and scrying 1 is pretty nice. This isn't the most broken version of a 3 mana 2/2 flyer we've ever seen, but this card is quite nice. Gaining 2 life is like a meaningful like upside on this sort of card, because the downside with flyers is they often make it harder for you to race in like straight up battles of racing, because you're not gaining like, you're paying 3 mana for like a understated card to get the evasion, but gaining the 2 life means that you'll still be able to keep up in the race. So I think this card is probably just a rock solid C, the sort of card that you're going to see draft in, draft out. Any sort of deck can play it. It's good in control decks. It's good because it gains you the life. It's good in aggressive decks because it's got evasion. Flash means that it can be used with all the synergy pieces. So depending on how the synergy shakes out in the format, I could see this being like a C+, but in a lot of decks, it's just going to be a rock solid card that you're happy to play. Next is Steer Clear. They got a lot of puns in this set, and I really do appreciate that. There's the bull that's just sending his rider flying. I don't know how that saddle girth is attached, but it looks like it was not done very well. 1 mana, instant, deal 2 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. It deals 4 damage to that creature instead if you controlled a mount as you cast this spell. So importantly, your opponent can't disrupt this by like killing your mount in response, because you'll still have cast this spell while you had a mount. And being able to do a 1 mana deal 2 is not great. That sort of card has historically been pretty bad, definitely like a D or maybe even D-. Being able to deal 4 sometimes means that it's probably a build around a D+, but nothing too special. It's more of a situational removal spell that you'll sometimes get to use. But it can definitely be pretty nice if you're a defensive deck. So if you're a defensive deck, you care more about being able to kill small creatures, and so this gets to be like maybe a D+ or a C- in the right defensive deck. But white decks often are kind of aggressive, and so in the aggressive variants, it's more of like a D, because your opponent gets to block before you can use this trick. So yeah, that's kind of my analysis. Next is Trained Erynx. It's 2 mana for a 3/1. Historically, medium stat line. It's sometimes good, sometimes not. It really makes pinging effects like we saw on that red-green card much better when 3/1s are fairly common. It attacks while saddled, gains first strike until end of turn, and you scry 1, and its saddle cost is only 2. One important thing about saddles is the creature can saddle up. It can mount up and get ready to ride, even if it's summoning sick, because it's not like attacking or doing anything like that. So you can still tap the creature. It does mean it can't block and stuff like that, but you can like play this on turn 2. Turn 3, you play your 3-drop, immediately saddle up, get that scry, and get that first strike, so it's harder to deal with. So then this card is just probably in your aggressive deck. It's like a C. In your defensive decks, it doesn't block particularly great. I mean, a 3/1 is a decent blocker, but it's not like you're getting that much value out of the ability, and you can like pick up decent blockers or defensive cards. So this is probably like a C- in a defensive deck and a C in an aggressive deck. And so in the aggregate, it's probably like closer to C-, because you want your cards to be more consistent if you're going to be taking them highly. But still, also a really good payoff for your mount deck. So if you have like a green-white mounted deck, this card goes up in value. Next is Vengeful Townsfolk. 3 mana 3/3, already okay stats, and whenever one or more other creatures you control die, you put a counter on the Vengeful Townsfolk. That's a pretty good card. They've done Unruly Mob, which is like a 2 mana 1/1 with this text on it, and even that card was like more like okay playable sometimes. And a 3 mana 3/3 that just grows over time when your other creatures die, just rock solid. I think that's probably going to be a C. Or C- if your deck is like not going to have tons of other creatures in it, or you're not going to get in combat, but it's limited. You get into combat all the time. And even if your opponent is like going to lengths to kill this, it's a 3 mana 3/3 at the end of the day, and it's got pretty decent upside. It can just kind of run away with the game. So I'm going to give this a nice rock solid C. Moving on to blue. First up is Lone Shark, 4 mana, 3/4, so okay stats. If you enter the battlefield, if you cast 2 or more spells this turn, you draw a card. So that's pretty nice as well, kind of the double spell theme that we saw in red-blue. And it has plot for 3 and a blue. So this is actually a pretty big downside of plot, which I wanted to cover when we first got to the cards. Delaying having a 3/4 on the battlefield can be pretty substantial. So even though the following turn you're going to get to double spell and draw a card, the fact that you essentially do nothing on your 4th turn of the game, if you're putting this into layaway for the plot, is pretty wild. One thing that is good about this card is that in the late game, if you just like draw this with 6 mana, you can play like 2-drop and then play this. Then you don't have to put it on plot first, so you can still get the card draw. But I would generally say that this card's probably closer to like a C- rather than a C, because a 4 mana 3/4 is not the best. And the fact that you have to like delay it by an entire turn if you want to get the plot going. Actually, I'm reevaluating, because if you have other plot cards, then this can be a really nice payoff for them, because if you've like plotted a card before turn 4, then you can play this card as a 4-drop after you've played your other plot card. So I'm back up. I think this card is probably a rock solid C. You generally don't want to be plotting with this one, but you can use it as synergy for your other plot cards. And yeah, so I'm gonna give this a nice little C. It is a 4-drop, so you don't need to prioritize it that highly. And I guess you don't want it in every deck, so probably stick with C- for now, but in the plot decks, it's a C. Next is Slickshot Vaultbuster, 3 mana for a 1/4 Vigilance, so it's also a rogue, so keep those Outlaw watches ready. It gets +2/+0 as long as you've committed a crime. So kind of a nice little card for maybe a blue-black deck that has a lot of crime committing. We have yet to see a card that's like really consistently able to commit crimes. I guess the red-green card that let you sack treasures, that's a way to commit crimes, to like target your opponent with pings. But we haven't seen any like blue-black cards really that commit crimes consistently. So that's something to keep an eye out for, especially as we see more cards get revealed, is look for ways to consistently and easily trigger committing a crime, because that's the sort of thing that'll really power up this sort of card. As it stands, a 3 mana 1/4 Vigilance is just not a very good stat line. So there's probably like a D+, especially because a lot of the time you're going to be more defensive deck if you're in like a crime committing deck, trying to get that value with that blue-black card we saw that comes back to your hand to get extra card draw and stuff like that. And in those cases, you don't really want to like be playing like cards that are trying to attack, and 3 mana 1/4 doesn't like, it blocks okay, but it doesn't really like block that well, because it's kind of just understated. You can get a 2 mana 1/4 or a 1 mana 0/4 in this set already. And so this card's kind of in an awkward place where it's not the most aggressive, it's not the best defensive, and so it's probably not going to end up very good spot. So I'm probably going to give this a D, at least pending seeing the cards in the set. But at the current time, I think it's not going to be that great. Next is Black Snag Buzzard, moving into some black cards. 3 mana 2/1 when it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if a creature died this turn. So maybe white-black is the color that cares about creatures dying, which does make that 3/3 a little bit better, of course, that we saw in white just a second ago, the Vengeful Villagers or whatever it's called. This card also has Plot for 2 mana, and Plot for 2 mana is really nice because if you don't have a 2-drop, being able to set up your plots actually seems quite good, and it'll let you play the bird on a turn where a creature died, so you can like plot on turn 2, turn 3, kill their creature, and then play Plot, and then you get a 3/2 flyer for 3. This card seems really, really nice to me. I'm really high on this card. It fuels double spell synergies. It just seems like it does a lot of little things well. And a 3 mana 3/2 flyer is no joke. Like, that card hits like a truck. And a 3 mana 2/1 flyer is not embarrassing. Like, you can definitely just play that if you top deck it late. So I'm going to give this card a C or a C+. I'm going to give this a C for now because it seems like a lot of black decks care about committing crimes or outlaws. So maybe it's not like in the highest synergy. But like, as you can tell, I haven't given a lot of C's because just a little note on my grading scale. C's are the sorts of cards in a draft where I'm like, okay, this is a card that I'm playing and I'm guaranteed to play. I'm taking it and I'm guaranteed to play it in my deck. That's kind of my definition of a C. Like, any deck that I'm playing that's a black deck, it's going to go in. That's why I've been giving some conditional C's where it's like, if I'm an aggressive deck, this is a C. If I'm a defensive deck, it's a C-. Like, C- are like cards that I'm like, most of the time going to play. And then D+ are cards that like, okay, I don't prioritize these at all, but they're the sort of cards that'll get into my deck eventually. C+ are cards that are like, okay, I'm happy to take this kind of early and it'll always make in my deck. And then B's are the cards that are like, okay, I'm going to like change the way I draft other cards to get this into my deck a lot of the time. But yeah, Black Snag Buzzard I think is probably going to be a rock solid C, and it can even go higher if you have synergies with it. Next is Desperate Bloodseeker. 2 mana 2/2 lifelink. Historically a pretty good stat line, especially on some white creatures in the past. Really good for racing situations. And when it enters the battlefield, target player mills 2 cards. So importantly, you can target your opponent to commit a crime, which is really, really nice, or you can target yourself to fuel graveyard synergies. This is the sort of card that always, and I mean always, overperforms. Maybe not literally always. The definition of always starts to elude me. But this card has performed better than it looks almost every single time we've seen it. I think this card's going to be a C+, maybe one of the best black commons. You can commit a crime for your 2-drop. You can get lifelink to get a life advantage. The only time where this card wouldn't be like really good is if the format's slow and the life gain doesn't matter, but that has not been the case in many recent formats. And also, even in slower formats, there are still aggressive decks. And also the fact that you can commit a crime with this is really nice, because when you target your opponent to mill them, that does count as committing a crime. So keep that in mind. You can use this for crime synergies. You can mill yourself if you're green-black and really want to fuel your turn 3 Honest Rutstein or something like that. But that's just something to keep in mind. This card looks really good to me. Moving on to Raven of Fell Omens. So yeah, just the committing a crime text. Targeting opponents, anything they control, and or cards in their graveyards is a crime. So targeting your opponents, you say target opponent with this last card, target player mills 2 cards. So you're targeting your opponent. Just wanted to double check that for people that maybe aren't as familiar with committing a crime, as none of us have actually played with these mechanics, and so it's easy to get confused. Raven of Fell Omens, 2 mana 1/2 flyer. Not the best stat line on its own. When you commit a crime, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. That's really good text. If you can commit like even 2 crimes after playing this card, then that's really, really good. The downside of like playing a 2 mana 1/2 flyer is that it's not going to hit very hard and it's not going to be very good in combat. But if you're hitting them for 1 a turn and you drain them for 2, like, how many attacks are you realistically getting with this anyway? Like, I mean, yeah, this is probably like still like a C. Like, if you're committing a lot of crimes, it goes up a little bit. And if you're not committing a lot of crimes, or if you're not aggressive, it probably goes down. But the fact that you gain 1 life is also quite nice, and it's a 2-drop with evasion. I'm a fan of this card. I think it's quite nice. I'm gonna give it a rock solid little C here for now, though it is kind of dependent on your deck. It's significantly worse than the last card we looked at, which maybe means like it's going to be competition with that card, and you'd much rather fill your deck with those. So maybe this is a C-, but I don't think it falls into the D range because I feel like it's the sort of card that you're going to play most of the time if you have some crimes to commit. Especially because if you get multiples of these, your opponent's like losing chunks of 2 life at a time. You're chipping in. Like this thing, if you play it on turn 2, is really quite good. I guess in the late game, it's not a particularly great draw, but I mean, a lot of 2-drops aren't. So yeah, I'm kind of like talking myself lower and lower and lower, but I'm just going to stick with C- for now. Moving on to red, Discerning Peddler. 2 mana for a 2/2, so just rock solid stats. When it enters the battlefield, you can discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So just nice little like slight impact card. I'm just going to give this a C- and move on. It's the sort of card, it's a rogue, so it's your outlaw synergies. It's the sort of card that smooths your draw. In the late game, it's a nice top deck because it can get rid of dead land. You can fill your graveyard if you have some like graveyard synergies, but that doesn't seem to be a huge theme. But generally, it just seems to fit enough themes and has an immediate impact on the game, and is a card that I'm probably going to be pretty reasonably happy to play. So C- I'm going to give for this one. Nothing too crazy, but definitely the sort of card that you'll be happy to have. Next is Mine Raider. 3 mana, 3/2. Trample, enters the battlefield. If you control another outlaw, create a treasure token. So all of a sudden, that last card looks a lot better because having a 2-drop outlaw all of a sudden gives you a major boost. 3 mana, 3/2 that makes a treasure has been historically okay. We saw that exact card in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and it was totally fine. Trample is a little bit of an upside, but not a crazy upside on a 3/2. I'm going to give this card a D+. It just seems like the sort of card that you'll play in your Outlaws decks, but never really prioritize. Next up is Quill Charger. The Porcupine mount is in the building. When it attacks, while saddled, it gets +1/+2 and menace. It's already a 4 mana 4/3, and it can attack as a 5/5 menace creature with only a saddle cost of 2. Yeah, sign me up. This card is an absolute beating. I mean, it is a 4-drop, so you don't need to prioritize it that highly in the draft, but like when my opponent plays this card against me, I'm going to be terrified because either they're going to be hitting me, like a 5/5 menace is no joke, especially when it's attacking on turn 5 because you get to play it on turn 4. And menace means that it's really hard to trade with it. Like you're going to get 2-for-1 a lot of the time if you trade with it, or they're going to be setting you up for a combat trick. And yeah, I think Quill Charger is in the C range for sure. Probably a C-. It's not a great defensive card, but red is almost always aggressive anyway. It just gets knocked because 4-drops tend not to be high priority picks these days. You want to make sure you get your 2-drops filled out, and then every card is so good these days towards the top end of the curve that by the time you're playing your 4-drop, it's usually going to be pretty good. But I think this card definitely is better than just straight up filler. So I'm going to put it in that C range. Next is Reckless Lackey. 1 mana, 1/2, first strike, haste. You can sacrifice it to draw a card and create a treasure token. This card seems quite good. It's also a pirate, so it does count as that outlaw status. And yeah, I think this card is pretty reasonable. A lot of 1-drops these days have been getting pushed. They've been getting better. And the fact that you can get rid of this card and get a treasure token on turn 3, so it essentially only costs 2 mana to use because you're getting that treasure token, makes it seem quite good to me. I'm going to put this in the C range. Probably just give it a rock solid C. You can also like block and then sacrifice this after it's done first strike damage as part of a double block, which is really nice upside. Like quite cool design where imagine you're on defense, you block with this and a 2/2. You do first strike damage, then you sacrifice your Reckless Lackey, and then your 2/2 will trade with their 3/3 or whatever it is. So that's just a nice little bit of upside. I'm just going to give this a C. I feel like it's the sort of card where your opponent plays it on turn 1, and you know that you're never going to be like coming out ahead of this card. Because 3 mana, essentially 2 mana, as we already said, to like sacrifice this just seems pretty reasonable to me. And you can even use the treasure to splash or things like that. So I'm going to give this a nice little C. Next is Bristlepack Sentry. It's 2 mana for a 3/3 defender. Plant Wolf. I love it. As long as you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. So really maybe fits into that red-green deck that we were potentially mentioning earlier. That's why I like to look at those uncommons first to see if there's any themes we can glean. But the thing that I also like about this is it's really good as a mount, which is hilarious. Or not a mount, as a creature to ride mounted creatures. So like if it has like a saddle cost of 3, this card has 3 power and you can use it to crew essentially, which is quite nice. So a 2-drop defensive card that's really good in the crew decks. And also once you start having bigger creatures, I think this card's going to play out really well and is probably going to be a decently high pick for green. I'm going to give it a rock solid C. I just imagine a lot of green decks wanting this card because it fits into green-white with the saddle, with the mount synergies. It fits into green-red with the big creature synergies. And we've seen cards like this in the past that can sometimes get unlocked and able to attack. And I think that this is going to be pretty good. Another thing that you can do with this sort of card, I think this is actually maybe a functional exact reprint of Drowsing Pteranodon, which was one of the best green commons in like M19. So I'm going to actually just bump this up to C+ straight up, because one thing I was about to mention with this sort of card is if you have a way to buff this creature specifically, so like give it a +1/+1 counter, put an equipment on it. It can attack, so because will have power 4 or greater. So yeah, I'm gonna give this card a C+, and it might even be better than that. This card is really sizable, really fits a lot of the synergy. It plays really good with those outlaw tokens. They give +1/+0 to things because that'll let this attack. Yeah, the more I talk about this card, the more I'm liking it. I'm gonna give it a C+, which is pretty high considering how I've been grading cards these days. But yeah, a 2-mana 3/3 that just blocks everything and then can attack is just like, if you just imagine a 2-mana 3/3 and this card actually like plays out very similarly to that in my experience with this sort of card in the past. Next up is Cactarantula, 6 mana, 6/5, costs 1 less to cast if you control a desert. There is a cycle of common deserts, 1 for each multicolored. We'll get to them in a little bit. But if you control a desert, it costs 1 less. So 5 mana, 6/5, it's got reach. When it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So if your opponent trades with it in combat, which is often going to involve a double block, then you're not going to get a card. But if your opponent tries to kill it with a removal spell, then you get a card. That's actually quite nice. I really like this card. I'm a fan, as they say. Reach means it's a good blocker. It doesn't gain you life, but we've seen a little bit of incremental life gain on some other cards already, like the Holy Cow. I can't believe they made Holy Cow like a playable card instead of a meme still. That's super funny. But giving this a grade is tough because it is so expensive to cast. I'm going to be optimistic and give it a C- because I haven't really seen this sort of card in the past where your opponent like doesn't want to use removal spells on it. Sure, they could still use something like a sacrifice effect, which is going to kill it, but we haven't seen any of those yet. And also just like that's not super common that you'll have your 6-drop and not another creature to sacrifice. And overall, the fact that you can cast this for 5 sometimes is quite good as well. So I'm going to give this a C-, which is pretty high considering it's just an expensive 6/5 that can get chump blocked and things like that. But the fact that it's hard for your opponent to come out ahead when exchanging with this is going to give me a little bit of hope there. Next is Hard Bristle Bandit. 2 mana, 1/1, add 1 mana of any color as a tap ability, and then when you commit a crime, you untap it. It only triggers once each turn. So the ideal with this is on your turn 2, you play this. On turn 3, you play like a 4-drop that somehow commits a crime, like maybe you target your opponent with something. You untap this, and then like you can start all of a sudden like tapping it on your opponent's turn to commit crimes, untap it again. I don't think that's going to be how it plays out. It's probably going to be a 2 mana 1/1 that taps for any color most of the time, which is already just quite a good card. It's going to be probably like a rock solid C in that capacity. It helps you sometimes with your splashes, just helps you with your fixing, helps you ramp, and I don't think the untap ability matters that much. If the format really like punishes X1s, this could be like a C- or even a little bit lower, but I think this is probably going to be a C and then a C- if you don't really care about ramping at all. Next is Patient Naturalist. 3 mana, 2/3, enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, put a land card from among the milled cards into your hand if you can't create a treasure token. This is probably going to be the best green common. It reminds me a lot of Eccentric Naturalist. There was a card that was a 3 mana, 2/3 from Innistrad Midnight Hunt, I believe I'm getting that right, but yeah, I think it was Innistrad Midnight Hunt. It was literally the exact same card, but without the treasure clause, and that card was like the best green common in that format by like a good margin. Now that format had graveyard synergies. This one looks like a green-black deck has graveyard synergies, but the fact that you have a failsafe of when you miss on a land, you get a treasure, then you're just getting a huge advantage. And yeah, a 3 mana 2/3 that draws you a card or gets you a treasure in the worst case scenario, really good card. This is probably going to be a C+ or B- level card. Even it could like definitely draw you into green. It's unassuming but quite a powerful card. Next is Tumbleweed Rising, 2 mana, but it has a plot of 3 mana. You create an XX green elemental creature where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Now, this is one of those cases where the plot cost is higher than the main cost because it's so beneficial to be able to play this on turn 3 and then on turn 4 just jam your like 4/4 and 4-drop and then just get another 4/4 into play. I think Tumbleweed Rising actually looks pretty reasonable to me. You can sometimes get like another 6, get like a 3 mana 6/6 essentially. You just have to wait for the right moment, and it's going to lead to some really big tempo plays where you can't really stop your opponent from getting a big creature at some point in the game if they've constructed their deck appropriately. And sometimes they'll just get like another copy of a 3/3 or something like that. Or in the late game, they'll already have a big creature, so they don't even have to do the plot part. Yeah, this is the sort of card that can be disrupted. So like if you kill their biggest power in response, this will check on resolution. It's not like one of those when it's cast cards. But I still think these cards are pretty good, and I'm just going to give it like a C. I think it's the sort of card where if your opponent plots with this, they're going to get another pretty sizable creature and make up the mana at some point in the game if they've built their deck correctly. And even like it's kind of hard not for this to do something. I think it is really bad if you have no creatures in play. So I'm actually going to downgrade it to a C- just because it does need something to go right. Like if you only have one other creature that kill it in response, you just lose the game. So if you don't have a lot of creatures, it's probably even a D+. But green decks often have a lot of creatures, a lot of big creatures. So I'm going to give this a C-. Next is Gold Pan. So we're into the artifact section. So this is the sort of card that plays really well with that 3/3 Cat Defender that we looked at earlier. When it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token, and then it is equipped for 1, so it gets +1/+1. So it basically, you can either use that treasure immediately to just equip the card. So imagine you go 2 mana, play the 3/3 Defender, turn 3, play Gold Pan, equip. All of a sudden you have a 4/4 attacker, and you have that extra treasure token. This card seems okay to me. A lot of the time we've seen like 1 mana versions of this effect, that then you pay 1 mana to equip. That's like a short sword variant. That card is historically okay. Historically okay. The thing that this will really be dependent on is how symmetrical the stat lines are. Because let me give you an example. And this is just a general concept for this sort of effect as a whole. If the format is filled with 2/2s and 3/3s and 4/4s, which we've seen a decent number of, we've seen a few 2/2s, we've seen a few 3/3s, we've seen a couple of 3/2 flyers or 2/1 flyers or things like that. But if the format is filled with 2/2s and 3/3s, and 4/4s, then getting a +1/+1 matters a lot, because all of a sudden your 2/2s trade with their 3/3s, your 3/3s trade with their 4/4s, and so forth. If, however, the format is anti-symmetrical, which means it's filled with 1/3s and 2/4s and 3/1s and 3/2s, as a lot of sets are, they aren't all filled. I mean, obviously it's always on a range, but if the format is filled with 3/2s, for example, 2/1s and 3/2s, your 2/1 already trades with their 3/2. So making it a 3/2 doesn't change anything. It doesn't enable any attacks that you didn't already have. It only affects it if they had 2 levels above. So if they have the 4/3 or whatever. If you have a 1/3, giving it +1/+1 does not help it attack past a 2/4 or even other 1/3s. So this is going to be very dependent on how the exact stat lines of the format line up. Based on history, this sort of card is usually a D. Getting a treasure can potentially enable some ramp shenanigans, some splashing shenanigans, some like shenanigans, let's just say. So I'm going to give this a D+ for now, but it is going to be dependent on how the format breaks down. And so that's just kind of a fun little extra analysis. Next, we're going to talk about these lands. There is 1 for every 2 color combination. I'm not going to show all 10 of them, but they do exist. They have already been revealed. So Abraded Bluffs is a tap land that when it enters the battlefield deals 1 damage to target opponent. So it's the opposite of a gain land. And importantly, this counts as committing a crime. So if you're in one of the crime colors, like let's just say you're a blue-black deck that really wants to be committing crimes, this is the sort of land that you're really, really going to want to prioritize, because there is a blue-black variant. So I think that these lands will scale in importance based on how important your deck, how much you care about damage, first of all. So the red-white one, if you're in a red-white aggressive deck, you care about dealing a damage to your opponent. That's like a meaningful advantage. But also if you're like a blue-black control deck, you could care about the 1 damage because it triggers all of your cards that care about committing crimes. It turns your 1/4 and 1/4 vigilance into a 3/4 vigilance, and you just get to smack your opponent, or it bounces your card back to your hand, or it lets Lasav get a +1/+1 counter, or all of those other cards that we saw that care about committing crimes. It turns your, it just makes your creatures a little bit better, or whatever the little effect is of committing your crime. So the blue-black one's probably going to be pretty important. The red-white one's probably good just for aggression reasons. Red-black has some cards that care about committing crimes. Like if you commit a crime and you get that extra 1/1 outlaw token, you're in pretty good shape there. Your mercenary token, the 1/1 that can tap for things. So these are the sorts of lands that can definitely be high priority. And the fact that these exist in the format means that your life total is functionally going to be a little bit lower to start the game, because your opponents are probably going to have 1 or 2 of these in their decks. And that just means that you're going to be taking chip damage. So going to 1 life, all of a sudden, a huge risk. And that's something to keep in mind as well. Incremental life gain gets a little bit better when these cards are in the set, because you want to make sure you keep your life total a little bit higher. When the gain lands are in sets, the games tend to be a little bit slower. They last a little bit longer because you have that little bit of an extra buffer. And I can see why they added this opposite of a gain land, the dealing damage, because it does work so well with committing a crime and gives you a little bit more density of cards that commit crimes to help the things that care about that. But it might speed up the format a little bit if you're not careful to include defensive speed, a little bit of maybe life gain in your decks, because if your opponent just has 2 of these, then all of a sudden you're starting at 18 life some games, and it's just a little bit tougher to combat. They do come into play tapped, which can maybe mess up your opponent's curve when they're pinging you with these. But yeah. Also, there are some cards that care about deserts. We already saw that spider. So if you have those desert payoff cards in your deck, which maybe are going to be concentrated in like green decks potentially, but we'll have to see for sure, but probably like more of a green deck thing to care about deserts, especially because we saw that spider already. If your deck cares about deserts, then you can prioritize these a little bit higher as well. So a lot to like about these cards. I think they're going to range from like maybe even C+ level cards in your deck, depending, because like getting an extra benefit from your land is huge, and it can be much bigger than the 1 damage, as we've already discussed. So like the blue-black one of these, probably going to be a pretty high pick, because like a C+ maybe level card over like their medium cards, just because it's a land that just triggers all of your cards. Pretty good. So yeah, that's a long spiel about these lands. Remember, Abraded Bluffs is just 1 of 10. There's 10 of them, 1 for each 2 color combination. But I'm going to give these anywhere ranging from like C to C plus, depending, because you'll just want to take these over the like medium cards in your deck, the like C minuses of the world. You'll just rather have a land. You probably don't want to play too many of these, maybe 3, unless your deck really cares about them. Like the blue-black deck will probably play any number, but if your deck is more aggressive, you want to make sure you can still cast your cards on curve. But yeah, 2 or 3 of these in any deck is probably going to be pretty nice. Next up is the uncommons. We're starting off with Bovine Intervention. 2 mana, destroy target artifact or creature. Its controller creates a 2/2. This is the sort of card that you shouldn't play because it needs so much to go right. You need your opponent to not only have a creature that is much better than a 2/2, because giving your opponent a 2/2, that's like a real card that's going to trade for one. So you're 2-for-1ing yourself a lot of the time when you play this. You need your opponent to have something significantly better than a 2/2, and you need to draw this card in that exact spot. And if your opponent has like a 3/3, this card is just embarrassing. I'm going to give this an F. Just don't put this card in your deck. Next is Frontier Seeker. 2 mana, 2/1. When entering the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You can reveal a mount creature or planes from among them and put it into your hand, the rest on the bottom. This card's great. 2 mana, 2/1 that gets you a planes, already pretty good. And the fact that it can get a mount is also really nice. Now, you do need to make sure that you have the density of cards to hit these. One rule that you can generally think of is 4 cards is 10% of your deck. And so let's just say you have 8 planes in your deck. That means if you were only looking at 4 cards, you'd have a 0.8, you'd see 0.8 planes on average, because that's how 10% of the thing would work. Now, if you have like 8 planes in your deck and you have 4 mounts in your deck, then if you were looking at 4 cards, you'd see 1.2 on average. And so you're seeing 5 cards, so you're a little bit more likely in each of these cases. But it's just the math is easier with 4 cards if you're just doing it in your head, and then you just add like a little bit of extra. So you need to make sure that you're consistently hitting a card with this, but a 2 mana 2/1 is not embarrassing. And if it only hit like half the time, it would still be pretty decent. But the fact that it's going to hit like probably 75% to 80% of the time, or more, depending on how many mounts are in your deck, how heavy white you are, this card's quite good and definitely worth taking early. I'd probably give this a B-. It's the sort of 2-drop that just like smooths your draw, does everything you want it to do. And yeah, definitely worth an early pick as a 2-drop. Next up is Getaway Glamour. This is the first card we're seeing that has the spree mechanic. So it's the spree cards are represented by this little plus in the upper right, and spree basically means you can cast it for any of the additional costs. So you can play this for a spree with only one of the abilities, spree with both abilities, spree with the second ability but not the first one. So you choose 1 or more additional costs. So you can get +1. So for 2 mana, 1 and a white, you can exile target non-token creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Or for 2 and a white, you can just use the second ability to destroy target creature if no other creature has greater power. So you can kill like the biggest creature, or you can do both by paying both manas. Now, the cool thing about this is if you have the biggest creature and your opponent has the second biggest creature, you can exile your creature and kill their creature, because your creature will no longer be in play because the card happens in order, I believe. I think the way the clauses stack on this, and I assume they designed the card this way, is you can target your opponent's creature and your creature will no longer be in play by the time that effect resolves, and no other creature will have greater power at that point. So that seems pretty interesting. So if your opponent like goes for a removal spell on your creature, this is like the biggest blowout ever, because for 4 mana, you like exile your creature, protect it from their removal, kill their big creature. It is a little bit inflexible, but generally you want to be killing the biggest creatures anyway. It's only a little bit bad if you have like the biggest creature and you're losing on the board state, but that's not a huge downside. This card looks quite good to me. I'd probably give this like a C+, just because it's so flexible. I mean, these cards there's just so much upside. 3 mana to kill it's like a 3 mana kill spell a lot of the time, which is why it's not like crazy upside. But 2 mana to like flicker your creature as well. I'm trying to talk myself up into a B-, but I'm still going to stick at C+ for now. I think the 2/1 is a little bit better than this card, just because it's more proactive, but this is definitely a good card. Next is Lassoed by the Law. 4 mana, you exile target online permanent, and you get one of those little mercenary tokens. So it's like if you imagine a 4 mana 1/1 that exiles one of your opponent's creatures, generally they're not going to have enchantment removal, so this card just seems really, really good to me. This card's just a B, I think. Just you exile their creature, you get a 1/1, and 1/1s are like a reasonable, with that ability, it's pretty reasonable, I think. And yeah, I'm just going to give this a B and move on. It's just a really nice removal spell. Also pretty splashable. Like if you're playing like a control deck, you could totally splash this. Next is Prosperity Tycoon. 4 mana for a 4/2, not the best stats. You create a mercenary when it comes into play, which is quite nice. So all of a sudden you're getting like 5/3 of stats for 4 mana, and you can sack a token to give Prosperity Tycoon indestructible, and it does get tapped. So you have a 4 mana 4/2 that comes with a 1/1, so 5/3 worth of stats, and you can like pay 2 mana to sack a treasure or sacrifice your random like outlaw, your mercenary token, and that can be pretty nice. One thing to note about this is you can do the sacrifice thing while it's attacking. So for example, you play your Prosperity Tycoon in your aggressive deck, I don't know why I'm talking like an Australian, but you know, I think I started to misspeak. But like you play your 4 mana 4/2, then next turn you tap to turn it into a 5/2, attack them. If they block, you can sacrifice the token because the tapping part happens. It's not one of the costs of activating it. So you can do it while it's already tapped, which makes it a premium card in aggressive decks, probably a B- in aggressive decks. And even in defensive decks, the 1/1 is able to block. So probably just a B- overall. Like really nice card, just aggressively or defensively. The indestructibility part can be really annoying, especially if you top deck in the late game where you always have 2 mana available. So yeah, I'm just going to give this a B-. Next is Thunder Lasso. 3 mana, enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature, so you get a free equip. It gets +1/+1. When it attacks, you tap target creature defending player controls. Not in love with this card. Equip 2 is pretty steep for this sort of thing. It's also +1/+1, so all the stuff I said about equipment with +1/+1 before still lines up. The fact that there's a common that can give +1/+1 for cheaper, I'm just going to give this like a D+. In defensive decks, it's like a complete blank. Does very little for you in your defensive deck. In aggressive decks, sure, but you'd rather just be playing a creature, so maybe I'll just even give this a D. This isn't the sort of card I'm excited about. Next is Emergent Haunting. We only got to see a couple of blue commons, but there are a lot of blue uncommons, which is fun. This is a hard one to evaluate sometimes too. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, and it isn't a creature, it becomes a 3/3 creature, which is permanent. It just becomes a 3/3. So you play this on turn 2, turn 3, you don't do anything, it's a 3/3. All of a sudden you have a 3/3 flyer. So if you have instants in your deck, this card is excellent. If you have those cards that we already talked about where you can like exile them, it's excellent. You don't get anything when you immediately play this, but in the late game, you can start surveilling, which really matters. And on turn 3, you could just surveil and just have a 3/3. I think this card's really good. I think this card's like a B-, maybe even higher, depending on if you have your deck built around it. Like it can go higher than a B-, but I think in almost any deck, this card's going to be pretty good. It's not great if you don't have instants, but if you have instants in your deck, so you can like use your mana on your opponent's turn, just play this on turn 2, pass on turn 3, profit. It's like a little bit of a delay, but suspend cards can still be really good when they're this efficient. 2 mana for a 3/3 flyer is no joke, and it has an upside ability. This is probably just even better than a B-. It's probably just a B. Just a really nice card that I'm pretty excited to play, honestly. Next is Fleeting Reflection. 2 mana instant. Target creature gains hexproof. Untap target creature you control. Untap that creature until end of turn it becomes a copy of up to one other target creature. So it's kind of like a counterspell that protects your creature, and it can copy another creature. That part, it's a little bit narrow as a combat trick, as far as combat tricks goes, because you need, in order to win the combat, you kind of have to have another good creature that's better than the creature you're targeting in play, which means it's not the best if you like have your 6/6 and your opponent triple blocks it. You can't like use this to win combat. So I'm going to give this like a D+. It's not a great combat trick, but you can sometimes play it. Next is Marauding Sphinx. 5 mana, 3/5, Flying Vigilance Ward 2. This is why the sort of removal spell that only kills a tapped creature isn't always the best, because when they have their flying 3/5, you want to be able to kill it, and this is Vigilance. And Ward 2. When you commit a crime, Surveil 2. This ability only triggers once each turn. This card is excellent. 5 mana, 3/4 flyer, Scry 2 is historically a pretty good common. Like these days, it'd be a little bit small ball maybe, or a little bit smaller, but still good. But a 5 mana, 3/5 Vigilance Ward 2 is a huge body that's hard to kill. And when you commit crime, you Surveil 2, which just sets you up so beautifully. This card is just like a B, I think. This card is excellent. Definitely a reason to play blue. Definitely a card that makes you want to play blue. And yeah, really excited about this card. Next is Plan the Heist. This one's a little bit trickier. So 4 mana for a Surveil 3 if you have no cards in hand, then draw 3 cards. You don't want to play this if you have cards in your hand. That is the moral of the story. It does have Plot for 3 and a blue, so you can put it into exile and then play it when it's opportune. I think this card is bad. There's so much ways to get value in modern day limited. There are so many cards that you just want to wait for the right time to deploy them. Getting empty-handed seems really difficult. And so if you do have some sort of like blue-red hyper aggro deck that really gets empty-handed really easily, I could see you playing this card, but it's going to be like an F in most decks, and like then like a like B- or C+ in the decks that it really wants to play it, because even the decks that are trying to get empty-handed aren't going to always succeed. There's so many situations where you'll have like 2 lands in your hand and you're like, wow, I'm like at least 3 turns away from using my Plan the Heist, because I'm going to have to like draw my card, play a land, draw my card, hope it's not another land, play a land, and you just end up in these spots where you can't ever play your Plan the Heist. So I'm going to just call this an F for now, but we'll see if there's an opportunity to play it in some decks. Next is Shifting Grift. 2 mana, and it is one of those spree cards. It's a sorcery. You can exchange control of 2 target creatures, exchange control of 2 target artifacts, exchange control of 2 target enchantments. So could be good as more of a sideboard card, I feel like, or if you have a lot of those random like mercenary tokens running around. Like this has a lot of flexibility, The problem is it's hard to like 4 mana. You're putting yourself down a card by playing this in many cases because you're playing the Shifting Grift in order to swap, and your opponent gets one of your cards, you get one of theirs. If you have a lot of random mercenaries running around, maybe you give them a 1/1, you take their 4/4, that's probably worth it. If you have like enchantments that stick in play that you can give to your opponent and take one of their good enchantments, like as a sideboard card when you know they have one of those, that's probably pretty nice. Like you have your little like thing that exiled their creature in play, you give that to them, you take one of their good enchantments, all of a sudden you're in good shape. If you have a treasure token and you can take a good artifact, but it's not like there's a huge artifact theme, it's not like there's a huge enchantment theme, so swapping 2 creatures for this doesn't seem that good. I think there's more of a sideboard card or like a D level card in a lot of decks, but in the right matchup it's going to be like a C+. So if you have like a bunch of small creatures and your opponent has some 6/6s, like definitely try to maybe side this card in. But I think a lot of the time it's going to be like a D. It looks like you can always think of the way it's amazing, but then you end up in a board state where you have a 2/2, where you have a 2/2 and they have a 3/3, and you're like, yeah, I don't want to spend 4 mana to swap these guys. This looks terrible. So yeah, that's the danger of Shifting Grift. Next is Slickshot Lockpicker. That's a little bit hard to say. Slickshot Lockpicker. 3 mana for a 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback. They made flashback kind of a deciduous mechanic where they can bring it back sometimes, so kind of nice. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost, and it has plot 3, so you can like put this on its little plot and then bring it when it comes out of its plot. Just like layaway, or what was the other word I used for it? Scheming. But yeah, as a plot, you can put it in, and then you can cast like a really expensive instant or sorcery when you do bring it into play. I think this card is quite nice. If you have like a cheaper instant or sorcery, you can just play this immediately to get it, or you can use it for plotting. There are some cards, as we saw, that care about you casting 2 spells in a turn, and this enables that pretty much on its own. So I'm just going to give this a nice little, let's just say B-. I mean, it reminds me so much of Snapcaster Mage, and Snapcaster Mage is fantastic. And this card, like, if you have, like, let's just say, like, yeah, and the fact that it has plot means you can just always, like, use your mana on this and then just, like, enable some really good turns down the line. So I'm just going to give this a B-. Next is Visage Bandit. 4 mana for a 2/2. You can have it enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a shapeshifter in addition to its other types, and it has plot 2 and a blue. This really reminds me of that green card that we looked at, and it's funny because the green, like this is always a 4 mana 2/2. The green card isn't always something, but it plots for the same amount, 2 in a blue, 2 in a green. And I really liked the green card, but the downside of the green card was if you had no other creatures, you can't cast this. This one, you can always cast it as a 2/2, which is a meaningful change. And so when I gave the green card like a C- because it is quite good when it works, but doesn't do anything when it's bad, this one is a much higher floor, but the same ceiling of like you play a 6/6 and then you immediately play this as a copy. This can also copy abilities, which a lot of creatures have enters the battlefield abilities or relevant things other than just being stats. So I'm actually going to give this a C+, where being able to put this on plot and then copy one of your best creatures that you control is quite nice. So I'm going to give this a C+. Next is Binding Negotiation. We're into the black uncommons. Target opponent reveals their hand, so that will count as committing a crime. The tighter I bind them, the looser their tongues become. Jeez Louise, that's pretty brutal flavor text. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, they discard it. Otherwise, you may put a face-up, exiled card they own into their graveyard. Oh, okay. So, if they have... You may put a face-up exiled card they own. Oh, okay, I see what this is. So when your opponent does go plotting, you can essentially discard the cards that they've plotted with. That's interesting because it's essentially then a it gives you a way to kill something that they've already spent mana on. So one of the downsides of this sort of effect is you can use it as a discard effect and they are in top deck mode and it does nothing. And this card is terrible. The other downside is you're spending 2 mana to take a card from their hand, and they spend no mana on that card. But if you get rid of one of their plot creatures, then all of a sudden they spent like 4 mana to plot their guy. They're waiting for the perfect time to use him, and you spend 2 mana and get rid of their plot. And so all of a sudden you get a mana advantage, you kill the thing, and they don't get any benefits from it. So I think as a sideboard card, this is like a sideboard B or something like that, or a sideboard B-, where if you know you're playing against the plot deck, this card becomes a really, really effective sideboard tool. And if there are a lot of plot cards running around this format and everyone's plotting all the time, this card could be a main deckable like C. But I feel like generally I'm going to prefer to sideboard this card and have it be really, really good out of the sideboard versus main decking it. So we're going to give this like a special sideboard grade of like B-, where you don't necessarily pick this super highly in the draft. So you pick this at like the level of like a D+ level card or a C-, because if you're playing best of 3, you do want to prioritize sideboard cards sometimes, because just imagine your opponent spends 3 mana to plot their guy, or 4 mana or whatever it is, and then you just get rid of it. So yeah, I'm gonna give this a D+ in regular draft, or even a D, but as a sideboard card, it's really nice. It's like a B- or a C+ probably as a sideboard card. Next is Lively Dirge. The dirges are kind of sad and slow usually, but it's another spree card. The spree cards are pretty interesting and quite flexible and generally seem quite good when they have good abilities, as most cards are when they have good abilities. 2 mana, +1, you search for a card and put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. Or 2 mana extra, you return up to 2 cards to a creature for the total mana value 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Interesting. I don't love this one. The abilities aren't particularly great. 3 mana to put a creature into your graveyard, not the best. Or just any card, I guess, into your graveyard isn't the best. And then 4 mana to return a 4 mana value or less from your graveyard up to 2 creatures, but still 4 mana value or less for 4 mana. You're not getting a huge advantage. And sometimes this card does very little. You can combine the abilities to pay 5 mana to put a 4-drop into your graveyard and put it into play. So if you have a really good 4-drop, this card can be worth playing. But if you just have normal creatures, I wouldn't recommend this one. I'd probably just give this like a D. And if you have like an A+ level bomb rare in your deck, then that costs 4 mana, then this can be like a C+, because it's essentially a second copy of that card that costs 5 mana or whatever. But yeah, not my favorite card. Next is Rakish Crew. 3 mana, enters the battlefield, you get a mercenary. And whenever an outlaw you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Now, I don't love this sort of card because 3 mana, you get a 1/1. It doesn't really help you on the board state. And sure, the drain is nice, but it's not even for every creature. It's just for your outlaws. So if you have all outlaws in your deck and some sacrifice synergies and stuff like that, this card's actually like totally playable. But a lot of the time, you're going to have like 2/3 of your creatures be outlaws in a great scenario, like in the best case scenario. And then you're like not always draining them. And like there was a card called Bastion of Remembrance in Ikoria that was this card, but it didn't have it made just a 1/1 and it always triggered, or Bastion of something. And that card was pretty reasonable because every time something died, you were getting to ping them. The mercenary creature is better than the 1/1 you got in that case, but the ability here is slightly worse. So this is probably going to be like a D+ level card. It's just hard to get this to work because you put yourself behind on board by casting this, and unless you have like a way to flood the board. So like if you were playing some sort of Mardu deck and you combine this with the X spell in red-white and you make like 6 1/1s, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, every time one of these dies, I get to drain them. But yeah, this is probably going to be like a D+ level card, or maybe even a little bit worse. I don't see myself actively trying to take this card and play it. Maybe like a D, but D+ if you're like in a deck that has tons of outlaws. Like once you get like 10 outlaws in your deck, this card's like, okay, it's just, I'm not excited about this one at all. So yeah, it makes me think of like D level card. Next is Rattleback Apothecary. 3 mana for a 3/2 Death Toucher. Whenever you commit a crime, target creature you control gains your choice of Menace or Lifelink until end of turn. And you can target your Rattleback Apothecary to give it like Menace. Menace plus Death Touch makes it very hard to block profitably. Lifelink plus Death Touch makes it attack and gain you some life. You can give your other things Lifelink. This card seems pretty good to me. Committing a crime, gaining some life. As we already said, gaining life can be important in this set, it looks like. And so I'm going to give the Rattleback Apothecary a nice little C+. Also, Death Touch is just a great mechanic. Every card with Death Touch almost always plays better than it looks. Next is Rictus Robber. 4 mana for a 4/3, enters the battlefield. If a creature died this turn, create a 2/2 blue-black zombie rogue, and it has plot for 3 mana. So its best case scenario is you play it on turn 4 and get a 2/2. The plot ability makes it so your opponent's going to try to play around it, but sometimes they can't. The reason you'd want to play the plot ability is A, you have nothing else to spend your mana on, or B, you have a removal spell, so you're going to kill your opponent's creature and then immediately play this and just get a huge amount of stats. This card looks really good to me. This card just looks like a B. Like you get so much stats. 4 mana for 6/5 worth of stats, or 3 mana for 6/5 worth of stats if you use the plot ability. Yeah, this card seems really good to me. Maybe even better than a B. Like, it's not that hard to have a creature die because you can have your own creatures die with sacrifice effects. You can plot it, so you can really set this up. I'm going to stick at B for now, but like when your opponent like attacks you with a 3/3 on turn 3 and you have a 3/3, you're like, okay, I block. They play a land, play Rictus Robber. All of a sudden, you're just like, what? They play like a 6/5 on turn 4. It's crazy. This card looks really, really good to me. Maybe even a B+. I'm just going to stick with B because there are going to be situations. It's easy to think of the situation where you get the 2/2. And you are often going to get the 2/2 because you can plot, you can kill your opponent's creatures and get the 2/2. Usually you're only going to be able to kill your opponent's creatures and get the 2/2 if you've used the plot ability. But still, 3 mana to get a 4/3 and a 2/2, even if it's on layaway. Pretty good. So I'm going to give this a B. This card looks great. Next is Servant of the Stinger. 2 mana for a 1/3 Death Toucher. As I already said, love Death Touch. The Scorpions are the Stingers, I guess. It looks like it has a crab claw, though, so that's maybe interesting. When Servant of the Stinger deals combat damage to a player, if you've committed a crime this turn, you may sacrifice it. If you do, search for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. I don't think that ability is going to come up all that often. Sometimes you're going to have a card you want to search up, but spending 2 mana to go get it in normal limited sets, unless you have like a really, really good rare, You just won't necessarily want to sacrifice your 1/3 Death Toucher, and you'll have to have committed a crime pre-combat, which would generally imply using mana, which means you then maybe won't be able to play the card you go get. Still, it's all upside on a 2-mana 1/3 Death Touch, which is already a solid card. I'm just going to give this a C. It looks pretty solid to me. Next is Shoot the Sheriff. 2 mana, destroy target non-outlaw creature. It looks like there's a lot of outlaws running around, especially in certain color combinations. This does trigger a crime, and it is instant speed 2 mana, but I'm just going to give this a C+, because I'm assuming there's enough big creatures that you can kill that aren't outlaws, but I'm willing to think like that this card might not be very good, because if you're playing in certain color combinations, a lot of the key cards are going to be outlaws. So this could be like my instinct is saying, like if this were in a set with no outlaws, this would be like a B+, 2 mana kill anything. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. With outlaws, I'm going to give it a full letter grade down, and then considering I haven't at least seen every single card in the set, I'm going to give this just like a C+ for now, assuming that most decks are going to have some targets. But if there are some decks that literally have like all outlaws, then this goes down to like a C- in some decks and like a C+ against others, which means that if I was playing best of 3, I would probably main deck it and sideboard it out versus playing it in the sideboard and sideboarding it in when it looks good. In best of 1, I'd probably still follow that strategy, but it's going to depend on how many good outlaws there are. Currently, based on what I've seen, it looks like there's a lot of outlaws, but not enough that you're always going to face outlaws. So I'm still going to give this a C+, though it's quite efficient when it works. Next is Unfortunate Accident. 1 mana, Spree. So you can pay an extra 2 and a black to destroy target creature. So 4 mana, instant speed, destroy a creature, or an extra 1 mana to create a 1/1. So you can play a 2 mana to make one of the mercenary guys. Honestly, the mercenaries are probably like worth 1 mana, so you're only slightly overpaying. Like you'd probably pay 1 mana for a 1/1 that had that ability. And then you can pay 4 mana to get an instant speed, and then 5 mana is really where it shines, which is where you get a kill spell and the 1/1. We already talked about it with the white card, which is like the 4 mana white card that you exile their creature with the enchantment and you get a 1/1, which we already gave it a B. I think this card's a little bit worse because you don't always get the 1/1 unless you pay the extra mana, but it's an instant speed type card, so you can get some nice blowouts with that. So I'm going to give this a B as well, but I think the white card is probably slightly better because the sorcery speed is worth the slight mana decline. But if you play this at instant speed, say if your opponent attacks you and you can like get a blocker that's by surprise and kill their guy, that just seems pretty good to me. Though I'm actually going to go B-. I think the extra mana does actually matter a little bit, but yeah, B- seems pretty good. Nice removal spell. Next is Unscrupulous Contractor. 3 mana for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack a creature. When you do, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. We've seen this exact card before. There was a Scorpion, I believe. I'm forgetting the exact set the Scorpion was in. The Scorpion might have been in... For some reason, I'm thinking... Oh, it was an exploit creature. And it was in Crimson Vow. Boom. Memory. But yeah, there was a Scorpion that had this exact ability, and it was really good. Actually, the Scorpion might have had Death Touch, which makes it better. This has plot, so you can like set this up to sacrifice a creature. But this card is pretty good. You can sacrifice one of your random 1/1s, draw 2 cards, lose 2 life. The 1/1s are definitely worth sacrificing to this. I'm going to give this a C+, but if you have a lot of mercenaries running around, it goes up to B-, I think. Also, the plot, definitely an upside, so that you can like use this on a turn when you want to. The real nice thing about plot cards is they're usually on these like situational cards where it's like, man, it would be amazing if I had a creature to sacrifice to this, but I don't want to do this right now. So sometimes this sort of card wouldn't be good on turn 3. You're like, man, I don't have a creature to sacrifice, but I really want to get those 2 cards. So you can be like, okay, I'll spend the mana now. Later on, I'll play like my 4-drop that makes a 1/1 with it, and then I'll play this guy immediately, get those sacrifices. Yeah, this card looks great to me. I'm gonna get. It's probably a B-. I'm just gonna give it a B-. This card looks great to me. Next is Caught in the Crossfire. 2 mana Spree. Deals 2 damage to each outlaw creature. Deals 2 damage to each non-outlaw creature. So you can kind of sweep the board as you would choose, or you can pay 4 and deal 2 damage to everything. Seems pretty decent, especially the non-outlaw part. I mean, the outlaw part, because if they have a bunch of mercenaries running around, you can just snipe them all. This seems like more of a sideboard card, because red is probably aggressive and going to have creatures. But the other cool thing is if you have all outlaws, you can just deal only damage to their creatures. Actually, I'm just going to give this a speculative C+. I'm imagining your outlaw deck really wants this card as like a one-sided kill a bunch of your stuff or deal a bunch of damage to your stuff, and your non-outlaw deck can kill a bunch of outlaws or kill non-outlaws. I'll just go down to C. This card still looks really nice to me. Really sweet card and a great sideboard card as well. Next is Cunning Coyote. 2 mana, 2/2 haste. Nice. Until the battlefield, another target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains haste until end of turn. That is really, really cool. Because normally I was like, why would you ever not want to have your 2-mana 2/2 haste and play immediately? But now if you plot this on turn 2, then on turn 3, you can play your 3/3 and then play your Coyote. This card looks excellent to me. I'm just going to give this a B. This is the sort of card I'm going to be terrified of because it just does so much work. Oh my gosh, yeah. It's only good in aggressive decks, but this is the sort of card that like wins the game on its own. Like, oh man. Maybe it's only a B-, but still. I mean, the difference between a B and a B-, I mean, the minuses are just like kind of an extra metric you can use. I don't really try to spend that much time talking about grade stuff as much, or it's just like, I'll give it a grade and then maybe I'll be like, okay, maybe it's a little bit worse. So like I'll talk myself up and down a little bit. The minuses and pluses give granularity, which is important in a grading scale. But yeah, this card's probably more of a B- than a B because it doesn't take over the game on its own. But in your opening hand, this card is devastating. If they plot this on turn 2, you know you're about to get absolutely rolled. They play their 3/3, give it haste, attack you for 6 on turn 4, just on turn 3, just absolutely devastating. But yeah, Cutting Coyote looks really cool. Next is Longhorn Sharpshooter. 3 mana for a 3/3. Reach. When it becomes plotted, it deals 2 damage. When Longhorn Sharp becomes plotted. Whoa. So you can play this on turn 4 to plot it and deal 2 damage to any target. What? That's really cool. It's interesting because the reason I'm pausing is because reading it is a weird thing for me because like when it becomes plotted, it goes into exile, and I don't know how it can deal damage from exile. But I guess it's like the same way that you would just like have your like lightning bolt deal damage to their creature. Like it's like, okay, this is getting plotted, then 2 damage goes on the stack, then this thing goes to exile, or it goes to exile or whatever as that's happening. Anyway, enough of the rules confusion. This card looks really nice to me. 3 mana 3/3 when you're playing on curve is nice. And then on turn 4, if you like use this to kill something, and then the following turn you just get to play another 3/3 onto the board, trigger any double spell things. This card looks excellent to me. I'm just going to give this a straight up B. I think this card's really, really good. 2 damage to any target means you can burn your opponent out. And like a 4 mana, it's basically a 4 mana 3/3 that deals 2 to any target and has reach. And you just have to kind of play it on layaway if you're doing it that way, with the upside of being able to play a 3 mana 3/3 in the games where you really want that. Next is Resilient Roadrunner. Oh my gosh, they have the Coyote and the Roadrunner. Chasing the Roadrunner, Omen Port. I need to see if the Fox has any flavor text. No, it does not. Oh my gosh, but it combines. The artwork combines with the Roadrunner artwork. Oh my gosh, they made Looney Tunes in Magic the Gathering. Oh my gosh, that is awesome. Some people get mad with that. Hey, it's got protection from coyotes, and this is a coyote. Oh my gosh, Cunning Coyote. Literally Wily Coyote. They called it Cunning Coyote because it's Wily Coyote. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy. That makes me unbelievably happy. It's a 2 mana 2/2 haste, protection for coyotes. Obviously, it needs to have haste because the Cunning Coyote has haste. Resilient Roadrunner. Protection from coyotes, obviously. Can't be blocked this turn except by creatures with haste. And it can't be blocked by the coyote, and there's not that many haste creatures. I mean, there's some, but oh my gosh, this card's awesome. I think it's actually a little bit worse than the coyote because the coyote stuff is more like flavor text. There's not that many coyotes running around. Not being able to be blocked is really nice upside, but I think the coyote leads to more devastating starts. This being unblockable in the late game is really nice. So I'm going to give this a C+. I think I give the coyote a B-, and so this card's still quite good. Really nice aggressive threat, and I love this. Chasing the Roadrunner, Omen Port slang for wasting energy on impossible pursuits. That is just this may be my favorite tandem of cards in the set. Just absolutely awesome. It's hard for me to describe how happy I am that this is here. Oh my gosh, this is awesome. And the artwork is glorious. Just beautifully done. Chef's kiss. Kudos to Wizards of the Coast. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. Next is Scorching Shot. 2 mana, deal 5 to target creature. It is double red, but I'm just going to give that a B. That is such an efficient removal spell, and it triggers your crime cards. This card's excellent. Next is Aloe Alchemist. 2 mana for a 3/2 Trampler. When it becomes plotted, target creature gets +3/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. Well, that's pretty absurd. So you can use it as some sort of like pump spell in the mid game, or just play a 2 mana 3/2 Trampler. I'm going to give this a C+. Like turning your 3/3 into a 6/5 for the turn while you're just putting your guy on layaway. Like you can just get to cast it the next turn. It's not like you have to do this every turn. You just pay 2 mana, you cast your guy slightly slower, but in the mid game, that's such a huge utility. It's just like, maybe it's probably even a B- level card. Just like in the mid game, you just get to hit them for a massive chunk of damage. Like your 1/1 mercenary attacks as a 4/3. They're not going to want to trade a real creature for a 1/1. So you just deal 4 with this thing. Oh my gosh, such a good aggressive card. Love that. It is a 3/2 once it's in play, which isn't the best, but that upside is huge. You just get to hit for so much damage. So yeah, I'm going to give this a B-. Next is Outcaster Greenblade. 3 mana 1/2, so it's small. Enter the battlefield, search for a basic land card or a desert, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. It gets +1/+1 for each desert you control. So as I said, looks like green might be the desert color. I made that prediction a little bit earlier. And this card seems quite good if you have some deserts rolling. 3 mana for a 2/3 that gets you a land. As we already discussed, it's like a C+, B- level card. We already talked about that with the common that we saw. The fact that this can get any land, any basic land or a desert from your deck makes it even better because you can go search for a splash with this, which is really fantastic. I'm just going to give this a B- and call it a day. This card looks really good. And if you have like 2 deserts, it's a 3/4. And you can fetch up one of your deserts. This card looks excellent to me. Next is Rambling Possum. It looks way bigger than a normal possum. And as we can see by the humans for scale, it is definitely bigger than a normal possum. 3 mana, 3/3. Okay, decent stats. It's got Saddle 1, so you can use your mercenaries to crew this, which is pretty important because the mercenaries seem like they're going to be a little bit like you can maybe get some mercenaries in a lot of different color combinations. It's when it attacks while saddled, it gets +1/+2. Then you can return any number of the creatures that saddled it to their owner's hand. You may, you don't have to. So you can retrigger enters the battlefield effects. Oh my god, I'm just gonna give this a B. That seems devastating. It's a 3-drop that attacks as a 4/5. Oh my gosh. And you can bounce your creatures to retrigger enters the battlefield effects or let you cast spells again, or there's a lot of decent number of enters the battlefield effects. Like imagine the guy we just saw, the one that like lets you fetch a land up. You just get to play that guy every turn and you just hit him with their 4/5. Yeah, this card seems excellent to me. I'm just gonna give it a B. Really like this guy. And you can even block with it as a 3/3. It's like totally fine. Spinewood's Armadillo. He's eating his little cactus. That art is so cute. 6 mana for a 7/7. Ward 3. Ward 3 is actually huge. That makes it so hard to kill this. Like a lot of the kill spells, like even the 2 mana, I mean the 2 mana deal 5 in red doesn't kill it anyway, but like thinking about like 4 mana things that kill things or 3 drops that like murder type effects, like Ward 3 is a lot of mana. It means you're generally going to be able to like, they're going to have to spend 6 or 7 mana to kill your 6-drop, which is nice. 6 mana, 7/7, and you can discard it for a basic land or a desert, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle, you gain 3 life. Oh my goodness, it's like the elephant card from Dominaria United, the rare. Oh my gosh, this card is fantastic. I really want to give this thing like C+, B-. I mean, the fact that you get a 6 mana, 7/7 Ward 3, or 2 mana get a basic land, or desert, and you put it into your hand, then shuffle, you gain 3 life. The gain 3 life is really, really nice. It's like a land cycler that also gains you 3 life, which is really nice when you're spending the mana to just not affect the board and just get a land. I'm going to give this a C+, because I don't think I can quite justify giving this a B-. But like, this card looks really, really good to me. And like, it's going to be a problem, because in the late game, a 6 mana, 7/7 is no joke, especially with reach. It doesn't have trample, which is one of the downsides, because like there are chump blockers running around. But like being able to get rid of this in the early turns, kudos. Really nice card. Next is Stubborn Burrow Fiend. 2 mana for a 2/2. It is, oh my gosh, the badgers look very, very, those are sharp teeth. Jeez Louise. Badger Beast Mount. When it becomes saddled for the first time each turn, mill 2 cards, then it gets +X/+X, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. That scales very quickly. If you get to the mid game and you're like, my gosh, that's actually terrifying. Like if you have 3 creatures in your graveyard, you crew this into attacks as a 5/5. I mean, sure, it's going to take a while for that to happen. Like, that's huge upside. And saddle's only 2. Yeah, I'm just going to give this a B-. This seems really good. Really, really good. It doesn't do as much as you'd like on turn 2 for your 2-drop, but the fact that your 2-drop in the late game attacks for 5, 6, 7 damage, this is probably actually just a B. I'm just going to give this card a B. That seems really, really good to me. And I'm sure there's like downsides with like, oh, you're not always going to have 3 creatures in your graveyard, and oh, you're not always going to be able to attack. But the thing you can do with this, that is one of the reasons I'm giving it a B, is if you just have like, if you're just in a board stall, say, you just crew. You don't have to attack. You mill 2 cards. First time each turn. On their turn, on their end step, you crew. Oh no, you can only crew at sorcery speed. Never mind. I'm kind of back to reality on that. For some reason, I think you could saddle as an instant speed and just like mill 2 cards on both cycles. But yeah, it's probably just a B-. I'm just gonna give this card a B. It's a 2 mana 2/2, which is already good on turn 2, and then the fact that it's still good in the late game makes this fantastic. I think I'm gonna give this a B. Lava Spur Boots. 1 mana, equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has haste and ward 1. So as we already talked about with equipments before, this doesn't buff toughness, which is generally kind of a spot where you want to buff toughness, because then your 2/2 no longer trades with their 2/2. But giving it ward 1 can be nice. Giving it haste can be nice. I still don't think this is very good. I'm going to give this a D+, maybe even a D. The fact that you can turn any like random 1/1 mercenaries into 2/1 so they can actually trade with stuff for just 1 mana can be pretty good. That's maybe something I should have noted with the other equipments, is if you have random tokens running around, equipments get better. But it feels like you're going to be able to give stuff +1/+0 with the mercenary tokens if you want it. and those cards generally don't cost a full card. So I'm not going to give Lava Boots a high grade. I'm just going to give it a D+, and move on to the next one, which is Mobile Homestead. 2 mana, 3/3, has haste as long as you control a mount. This one's actually a vehicle, putting mounts and vehicles in the same set. Questionable maybe for confusion purposes, but the border's different, and I think that's going to be fine. When Mobile Homestead attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you can put it onto the battlefield tapped, so maybe some card advantage, and it's crew too. So if you control the mount, it's got haste. Seems pretty good to me. I mean, if you play this on turn 2, you're going to be able to maybe get some card advantage like half the time, a little bit less than half the time. Remember, there's 17 lands in the deck generally, so a little bit less than half the time you're going to get some value out of that. Yeah, 2 mana, 3/3 that can then, if you're crewing, do some work. Don't mind me. I'm just going to probably put this card in my deck. It's not that good in defensive decks because it does want to attack, and using your vehicles for defense, while okay, sometimes like it means that you're generally going to be protected from sorcery speed removal because like they kill your creature, you crew, in response you still have a blocker. It's not the best in blocking strategy, so I'm just going to give this a C, and I think it's going to be pretty fine in a lot of your aggressive decks, but not that good in your defensive decks. Next is Tomb Trawler, maybe a C-. Yeah, I'm gonna maybe give it a C-. You don't really necessarily love having that card in your deck, but it's solid. You'll play it a lot of the time. Tomb Trawler, 2 mana, 0/4, 2 mana, put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. I'm just gonna give this an F, save everybody some time. There hopefully are some cool decks where you just put this in your like deck to avoid decking, and then you're just like stacking your library at the end of the game. But this is not the sort of thing that I expect will happen very often in draft. So I'm just gonna give this an F. Recommend against playing it. And then our final card that we're going over today is Arid Archway. Enters tapped. If it does enter the battlefield, return a land to its owner's hand. If it does, it will return this way, surveil 1, and then it can tap for 2 colorless. This card is actually quite good, I think. It does tap for colorless, which isn't the best, but it's essentially a land that draws you another land, because this taps for 2 mana, and your other land that you bounce back to your hand is almost like you drew a card. Bounce lands in the original Ravnica were like really, really high picks, because they were lands that even though they came into play tapped, they drew you a card. And a land that draws you a card, even if it's just colorless, occasionally it'll scry you something, but that's only in the extreme late game, because the deserts generally come into play tapped, and so you don't want to play like 2 tap lands in a row necessarily, just for a surveil. But in the extreme late game, if you have another desert, you can do that. It's only another desert. It doesn't trigger on itself anyway. But this seems like the sort of card that can be really good. I'm going to give this a C, which is probably like right in the same range as you'd be taking the tapped deserts that are on color. And I could see it being better. The only downside is I don't know exactly how color intensive things are. Like we already saw that red card. And there do look to be like some cards. I mean, a lot of the cards are just typical, like 2 and a green, 2 and a white, whatever. But if there are cards in your deck that are like double pips, this does get worse. But as like your 17th land, you just go 8/8, play this thing. You can get a lot of value. That's extra upside on a land is pretty nice. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag #WeDraftAtDawn in the comment section down below. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this. Comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Subscribe for more draft videos, and I will talk to you next time.